没有共产党就没有新中国，没有共产党就没有新中国。共产党信了为民主，共产党他一心救中国，他这样人民解放的道路，他领导中国走向光明。他坚持了抗战8年多，他改善了人民生活，他建设了今后更主地，他实行了民主好处多。没有共产党就没有新中国，没有共产党就没有新中国。没有翁文化就没有马来西亚，没有翁文化就没有马来西亚。翁文化信了为民主，翁文化他一心救我们，他这个人民解放的道路，他领导马来西亚走向光明。他坚持了抗战8年多，他改善了人民生活，他建设了地后天主地，他实行了民主好处多。没有翁文化就没有新马来西亚，没有翁文化就没有马来西亚。Okay, hello everyone and welcome back to the brutal capitalist dictatorship of Kuala Lumpur. Okay, first of all, I want to express solidarity with both the working people of Palestine and Israel, not with the oligarchs on both sides who are funding the war here. So first of all, as you guys are aware, Hamas and the Israeli Defense Force are at war. Now, our solidarity as socialists should fundamentally be with the working people on both sides of the border here. So I don't want anybody to fall into campism, although I must say that both Israelis and Palestinians will suffer from a protracted war if a solution is not reached very soon. But first of all, I want to say solidarity with the working people on both sides, and I hope that a solution will be arrived at soon. It may take years, it may take decades, but God willing, you know, the Israeli and Palestinian problem will be solved, right? Now, that's another topic for another day, because today we are going to be talking about something that's been on my mind lately. Now, one thing you might notice about modern day conservatives like Jordan Peterson is that they tend to have a rather fatalistic and borderline nihilistic view of humanity, in the sense that they believe the world is inherently fair and, you know, it is good as the way it is, and the system isn't fundamentally broken because people in this world are promoted, or people advance in society based on their own quote-unquote merit, meaning that if you are poor and downtrodden, it is due to the fact that you're simply lazy, incompetent, or stupid. And if you're rich, it's simply due to the fact that you are thrifty and able to save money and invest it properly, and basically, you know, you have basically got a better brain than a poor person. Not considering the fact that a rich person may have inherited generational wealth, or perhaps been accorded a better education as a result of winning the genetic lottery, you know, choosing his or her parents before he or she was even born, right? Now, first of all, I think it's important for us to clarify what we mean by conservative or right-winger, right? When I say conservative, I'm certainly not referring to people who might look at me, for example, and say, I tak pakai sopan. That means I don't dress modestly, or I don't dress properly, because I always show a bit of skin every single day, right? I'm a freelancer, I get to dress however I like, and I do prefer tank tops, right? But that's not really what I mean by conservative. So for the sake of clarity, when I say conservative, I'm not necessarily referring to socially conservative people from a Muslim or Christian or Hindu background who might not be pleased with people breaking the norms of society, right? Although most right-wingers are socially conservative, you don't necessarily have to be socially conservative to be a right-winger, right? Because fundamentally, even American Democrats like Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton are right-wingers, right? In the sense that they are capitalist to the core, and they basically oppose structural change in order to create a fairer and more just society. The only place where they disagree with the people like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro is basically on social conservatism, right? Because people like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro would say that life would be better if everybody practiced strict industrial revolution gender roles, right? And gays should go back to the closet, or at least should act in a way that makes straight people comfortable. While, the liberals, I should call them liberals, are progressive only on social issues, but basically what they create is some kind of a woke capitalism, right? Which basically means more people of color or more transgender people in the army, or more transgender or person of color CEOs, right? Which is basically not what we want, right? It's kind of like green capitalism. You see what I mean? So, anyway, fundamentally, when I talk about the right-winger, I'm fundamentally talking about, people like Jordan Peterson or Thomas Sowell or anyone else who has this libertarian, capitalistic, Darwinian even point of view, right? Who believes very strongly in the mantra that you deserve what you get. So if you have money, you deserve to have money because you are thrifty, smart, and basically a very hardworking person. And if you don't have money, well, that's because you're a loser. I've never used the word loser, right? Because I don't think that poverty is a moral failing. So I would never use the word loser to describe my enemies. But anyone who uses the word loser to describe his or her enemies is also a right-winger by this definition, right? So, just so we're clear, right-winger fundamentally is a person. A right-winger is fundamentally a person who believes that the world is just as it is, and, instead of trying to change it, we must justify keeping it precisely the way it is. Okay? So, the more moderate right-winger, like Jordan Peterson, for example, will tell you that you shouldn't try to change the world because the world is good as it is, right? At least the society that they live in, right? Because it suits them so well. And fundamentally, if you try to change the world, you might end up creating something even worse, right? So it's not Jordan Peterson's Western chauvinism or his social conservatism that fundamentally makes him a right-winger, but fundamentally it is his belief that the world is good the way it is, and if you try to change it, well, basically you're only going to be spending money on false assumptions, right? Lee Kuan Yew would be nodding his head in agreement, right? Because Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, fundamentally believed that, students who scored better in their exams should get the best teachers and the best resources. And basically the Singaporean schooling system is basically like a talent show. So basically your fate or your caste is already decided in school. Because from Lee Kuan Yew's right-wing point of view, it is not pragmatic to spend resources on weak students because weak students are going to be failures anyway, right? So, those people are going to be the underclass of society. While, you should spend money and resources and the best teachers on the most promising students. And I'm sure my Singaporean friends who are honest can attest to this, right? But that is fundamentally the modern right-wing worldview. This idea that people have predestined fates, right? And if you try to go against this predestination, you will be very, very frustrated because you'll be, as Lee Kuan Yew said, spending money on false assumptions, right? But even then, the more moderate sort of right-winger, like Jordan Peterson or Lee Kuan Yew, except for the fact that he threw his political opponents in prison, they don't shit on the poor quite as hard as the more extreme type of right-winger, like Thomas Sowell, who has literally called poor, struggling people on welfare parasites. He has literally called people who are poor and struggling as parasites, failures, and basically a whole slew of other names. So while the more moderate right-winger like Jordan Peterson, for example, may say, you know what, the world is fair, defend the institutions the way they are, the extreme type of right-winger actually hates poor people, hates losers. Just like Donald Trump, for example, says, I hate losers, fundamentally. They have such an extreme contempt for the underclass of society. In the same way the Brahmin of India had a tremendous degree of contempt for the untouchables of society. And I suspect that's why they do not want student loan forgiveness, because, well, basically they don't want the children of the untouchables of society going to university with their own children. So that's why they want education to be only a privilege of the elite, right? Because fundamentally, children of elite people tend to be smarter, as Jordan Peterson even says in this clip.
Well, why hire a Harvard graduate? Well, it's the quality of the education. It's like, no, it's not. It's the fact that it's really hard to get in. All of the value of the Ivy League education is in the screening before the education starts. Now, that doesn't mean that people go to Harvard and they get educated, but they'd get just as educated if they went somewhere else. First of all, it's like every university contains more information than any student can ever possibly process. If you're super smart, you can be dropped into a state college somewhere, a low-level state college. You spend 4 years in the library. Like, what are you going to do, read the whole library? No. Right, so and the data on this is quite clear. It's like, and it's the same with private schools. The reason that people who go to private schools do better than people who go to public schools is because, generally speaking, the people who go into private schools are smarter. It's not the education that's any better. And so we radically overestimate the degree to which training works. So now you can train people to be stupid. But training them to be smarter than they are is really, really, really hard. So, like I said, it's a dismal literature. And the liberals think everyone's roughly equal and there's a job for everyone, you just have to train them. It's like, no, wrong. And the conservatives think, well, there's a job for everyone if they just get off their ass and work. It's like, no, that's wrong too. Even though, if you work, that's better. And, well, so that's on the conservative end. But the liberals won't take into account individual differences. Well, obviously, that's part of what the whole politically correct discussion is about. It's like, everyone's the same. It's like, yeah, they're not.
Yeah, students who go to private school are smarter. Not to mention that private schools' fees are exorbitant, right? I don't think, for example, that the general mass of people can afford to send their children to Harvard or to a private school for that matter. And I say this as someone who went to a private school myself. Doesn't mean that I'm smarter than some kampong person's kid. It just means that, I had the good fortune of being born to parents who could send me to a private school, right? Just like if you went to Harvard, you are among the elites in society because your parents can afford it. So basically, if you are trying to call for a more equitable distribution of wealth and a more equitable distribution of political power between the haves and have-nots, you are envious of more successful people, as if I am envious of the man who has his boot on my throat, you see. Or I am envious of the slave master who's whipping me if I were a slave. But fundamentally, the right-wing worldview, if you will, is a rather nihilistic and hopeless worldview that basically focuses not on reforming the system, but on keeping everyone in their place, right? And then people will say to me, didn't Confucius, the man whose name you use in your title, Comrade Confucius, didn't Confucius believe the same thing, right? Like Confucius himself said that a nation is good when everybody plays their part, right? And I think it comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of Confucius. When Confucius says a nation is good when a king is a king, a husband is a husband, a wife is a wife, a brother is a brother, and so on and so forth, right? Fundamentally, it comes from a Western misunderstanding, because when people say that Confucius was pushing for everyone to know their place, it comes from a hierarchical right-wing Western point of view. Because in actual fact, Confucius was basically saying for a society to run properly, everybody must cooperate. Keyword, cooperate with each other, right? And besides, even if Confucius had sexist and reactionary views, he lived, by today's standards, he had sexist and reactionary views. He lived 2,500 years ago. What do you expect? Even Buddha had reactionary and sexist views by today's standards. But Confucius was by no means a right-winger, in the sense that he also believed that education should have no class distinctions, right? The peasant who was learning under Confucius, as well as the son of the duke, were both equal students in his eyes, right? So basically they had to treat each other with respect, even though one was of a lowlier station than the other, right? So basically, no, Confucius cannot be said to be a right-winger by today's standards, even because Confucius was basically trying to uplift people through educating them, right? Not trying to keep them in their place by hoarding the education to a certain class of people, like the three noble families of Lu were doing. And some leftists will point to Adam Smith, the Scottish moral philosopher who wrote The Wealth of Nations, and say that he is the cause of this problem that we have right now, of basically toxic elitism and hatred for the masses and hatred for the have-nots, right? People basically blame Adam Smith because Adam Smith is the unlikely hero of virtually every modern libertarian, and every modern neoliberal fascist seems to praise Adam Smith. In fact, Margaret Thatcher even had a copy of Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, in her bag everywhere she went, right? So it's very, very easy to basically come to the conclusion that, Adam Smith was the cause of the problem we have today. But something ironic is that when you actually delve into Adam Smith's work, you will find that Adam Smith is about as close to the average American Republican as Jesus is to the prosperity Christian like Joel Osteen. Because most people, thankfully for these right-wing Republicans or neoliberal fascists, most people don't actually read Adam Smith, because Adam Smith is admittedly not an easy person to read, right? But if you actually delve into his literature, you will find that Adam Smith would be disgusted with the people who call him their hero. It is not due to the benevolence of the baker, the butcher, or the brewer that we should expect our dinner, or in a more Malaysian context, it is not due to the benevolence of the mamak man or the chap fan lady that we should expect our lunch. But the fact of the matter is that most right-wing neoliberal types like Sowell or his Sifu, Milton Friedman, will take that quote of Smith's and just leave it at there. And they will say, look, competition is good actually. competition is great, and basically all humans are naturally selfish. So, there's basically no moral incentive for me to basically support your universal healthcare, or for me to support uplifting the poor, or basically support the more equitable distribution of wealth, right? But the fact of the matter is that they ignore the fact that Smith did not fundamentally consider himself to be an economist. No. Adam Smith fundamentally considered himself to be a moral philosopher. Adam Smith never shat on the poor. Adam Smith never called them useless, incompetent failures. Adam Smith was a person who was not trying to preserve the state of the world, but to basically improve the human condition, right? And what's ironic is that these people treat Adam Smith and Karl Marx as if they were, opposing ideologies, when in fact, Karl Marx is the continuation of Adam Smith, right? Karl Marx used Adam Smith's theory on labor value to develop his own theories in Das Kapital, right? Karl Marx did not consider Adam Smith to be some evil, rapacious reactionary, but rather Adam Smith was basically a philosopher when society was transitioning from the feudal to the capitalist mode of production, right? When Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, the French king still had his head on, right? The king of France still hadn't even had his head cut off yet, right? So most of Europe was still living in a feudal state of consciousness, right? So when Smith talks about free trade and free enterprise, Smith is not referring to basically billionaires exploiting and oppressing their workers. Smith is certainly not referring to destabilizing foreign countries and exporting misery to poorer countries. No, when Smith talks about free trade, he's talking about the freedom for the peasant to pursue commerce and trade in order to uplift his own material conditions. Commerce that he had been barred from for centuries under feudalism. Because under feudalism, if you were a peasant, you were a peasant for life, right? Now, part of the reason why the peasants of feudal times in Malaya, right, were not really motivated to accumulate vast sums of wealth was simply because if they accumulated too much wealth, that would be taken away by the sultans or the feudal lords. Because fundamentally, the peasant, after reaching a certain degree of wealth, would have his wealth confiscated by the sultans. But please do not mistake this for socialism, yeah? Because the sultans would basically use this wealth for his own personal revenue, right? His own personal expenditure. So fundamentally, that's part of the reason why the Malay peasant didn't really feel a need to be extremely productive. While on the other hand, the Chinese Tauke, the Chinese middleman minority, was out of the feudal system, and that's why the Chinese was able to accumulate vast sums of wealth, right, over generations. So if we look at Smith encouraging free trade in the peasants, right, in the 18th century, we can see that Smith's writings could be construed as revolutionary at that particular point in time, right? Just like Karl Marx himself considered the bourgeoisie to be a revolutionary class when it was overthrowing the feudal lords, right? But after that, after the feudal lords had gone, the bourgeoisie then made themselves the quote-unquote new feudal lords. But instead of basically measuring his wealth by land, the bourgeoisie measures his wealth by capital, right? And basically the peasant, ends up transitioning into the proletariat or the industrial worker. And the proletariat basically has no capital to speak of, in the sense that the proletariat does not own a factory, does not own the tools. These things are owned by the new feudal lord, the bourgeoisie. And in order to survive, to live a subsistence existence, the proletariat has to sell his labor power to the bourgeoisie. And the proletariat pays a rent to the other strata of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, in order to keep himself alive, right? So the rent that the feudal peasant would pay to the feudal lord would be a chunk of his produce, right? But now the proletariat the proletariat is paid in wages, and with these wages, the proletariat basically uses this to survive, right? So Marxists actually viewed the bourgeoisie as revolutionary when they were overthrowing monarchical and religious powers, but they then became reactionary when they appointed themselves the new ruling class. But back to Smith. You see, when Smith was penning The Wealth of Nations, capitalism was still in its infant stage, right? Smith did not have the clairvoyance in order to predict things such as oligarchs, which means the most competitive and most ruthless and most cutthroat capitalists, then seizing power and basically crushing the competition and basically appointing themselves the new ruling class, like the Rothschild family or the Trump family, right? Basically, Smith did not foresee this happening because Smith did not have the magical power of clairvoyance, right? When Smith was penning The Wealth of Nations in the 1700s, the mode of production was just shifting from feudalism to capitalism, right? So Smith fundamentally did not foresee the rise of neoliberalism either, right? And he certainly did not foresee the rise of people like Margaret Thatcher or Thomas Sowell, who would abuse his name in order to justify their abuses towards the downtrodden, right? But fundamentally, Smith, as I've said, considered himself to be a moral philosopher. He studied moral philosophy in university, and which is ironic because the American Republicans hate arts and humanities because they say it creates a sense of grievance politics, right? It creates grievances in people, and it basically creates, people who are who have no use to society, but to basically stoke people's grievances. They hate these subjects and want them to be scrapped, right? Well, Smith studied moral philosophy. Yes, moral philosophy in college. He did not study mathematics. He did not study, what else? He did not study a so-called hard subject like chemistry or biology. No, Smith was an arts graduate. And Smith considered himself, as I've said time and again, a moral philosopher who is trying to improve the human condition, not keep the world the way it is, right? And the funny thing is that they don't realize that Smith also did not like landlords, because he considered landlords to be useless, blood-sucking parasites who don't produce anything of value, who just, who basically subsist by, renting out land to poor people. Because yes, while Adam Smith argues that the metaphorical invisible hand was the driving force behind all human interactions, that is to say that self-interest is the driving force behind all human interactions, Smith never ever shits on the poor. He never ever argues that people ought to starve or be left destitute and homeless. And he would be horrified to see some of the policy proposals put forward by American Republicans. Basically, Smith himself, as I've said time and again in this video, considered himself a moral philosopher trying to improve the human condition, right? Human dignity was to Adam Smith like oxygen to one's lungs or water to a fish, right? Adam Smith also believed that ethics were inseparable from success. That is to say that a businessman, according to Smith, who is to be successful ought to be ethical at the same time, right? Now, you can disagree with Smith on this, and I certainly do, but the fact of the matter is that according to Smith, that morals, or good morals rather, are not just a luxury to success for the best capitalist. According to Smith, good morals are a necessity in order to succeed, right? Because fundamentally, if you're a boss and you give your workers better working conditions and you treat them better, not only will they appreciate you, but they will also basically try to improve their own performance, right? And they will basically work harder for you and basically increase your capital even more. And with the increased capital, you are therefore able to give to charity or pay higher taxes, something which the Republicans don't seem to notice about Smith's writing, and therefore improve the collective good, right? Adam Smith believed that wealthy and powerful people have a responsibility to pay higher taxes and basically give money, more money, to improve the collective good, right? Of course, he didn't think that it ought to be forced upon them, but he himself did not believe in this idea of the rapacious businessman, basically keeping his workers at his mercy and basically bullying and oppressing his workers. No, that's not Adam Smith, right? But sadly, Adam Smith's vision for basically a world where people would engage in clean and fair and moral commerce sadly did not pan out, right? Because it morphed basically into the Dickensian workhouse, which was rather or the modern version of the Dickensian workhouse, the sweatshop, which was not what he was aiming for, right? But basically Smith wanted to utilize people's self-interest for the greater good, not basically empower a small select group of people at the expense of the majority. That's not Adam Smith. And Smith makes it very, very, very clear that the wealth of a nation is not to be found in the accumulated gold or silver in the coffers of the elites, right? Smith's idea of a wealthy, prosperous nation is a nation in which its people, not its elites, its people enjoy a civilized standard of living. That was Smith's idea of a wealthy nation, right? So no, modern day right-wingers, modern day libertarians or neoliberals have certainly read Smith, but they are not his supporters, they are his enemies. So who are we to blame then, if not Adam Smith, for the odious view of the right wing? Well, this man, in my opinion, that we should blame, lived way before the advent of modern capitalism. This man is none other than John Calvin. And if you read chapter 21 of his book, you will then understand why modern right-wing ideology has morphed from classical liberalism into something ugly, repugnant, and even fatalistic. Why do they believe that certain people are the way, or certain people are there because of their own personal failings, and that certain people who are successful deserve their success, while people who are poor deserve to endure the brunt weight of their own personal failings? Or why do they believe, for that matter, as Winston Churchill did, that certain races were more deserving of rights, right? Well, if you understand the concept of predestination, right, you can easily understand how modern laissez-faire capitalism or social Darwinism came to be. So, if you understand John Calvin's theory of predestination, you can therefore understand how the ugly aspects of the modern West came to be, such as, unfettered capitalism, contempt for the downtrodden, fascism, and social Darwinism. How did these things come to be? Well, it all came from predestination. You see, John Calvin was a Christian minister in the 16th century who believed in this concept of predestination, in the sense that from the day people are born, it has already been decided who's going to hell and who's going to heaven. And there's nothing that can be done about it, basically, because those who are going to heaven are among the elect, and those who are going to hell are not among the elect, right? So why then do Calvinists pray? Why then do Calvinists go around spreading their gospel? Well, simply because God commands it in their view, right? But Calvinism fundamentally is a fatalistic, nihilistic ideology, and full offense if you're a Calvinist, because it's also likely that you have a rugged individualistic worldview and you believe the world is inherently meritocratic, right? Yes, I am judging you if you call yourself a Calvinist. But fundamentally, Calvinism is basically predicated on the same just world hypothesis as the right-wing ideologue like Jordan Peterson or Thomas Sowell. Calvinism fundamentally believes that the world is already just. Predestination is itself just. Because they use predestination to explain why, some tribes who have never heard of Jesus will be going to hell. Well, that's already decided by God, right? So, if you question God's will or you question God's mighty plan, well, that's heresy according to the Calvinist worldview. So, it is not our place, according to Calvin, in order to question God's grand plan. As Calvin explains to us, the covenant of life is not preached equally to all, and among those to whom it is preached, does not always meet with the same reception. This diversity displays the unsearchable depth of the divine judgment, and is without doubt subordinate to God's purpose of eternal election. But if it is plainly owing to the mere pleasure of God that salvation is spontaneously offered to some, while others have no access to it, great and difficult questions immediately arise, questions which are inexplicable when just views are not entertained concerning election and predestination. To many this seems a perplexing subject, because they deem it most incongruous that of the great body of mankind some should be predestined to salvation, and others to destruction. How ceaselessly they entangle themselves will appear as we proceed. We may add that in the very obscurity which deters them, we may see not only the utility of this doctrine, but also its most pleasant fruits. We shall never feel persuaded, as we ought, that our salvation flows from the free mercy of God as its fountain, until we are made acquainted with its eternal election, the grace of God being illustrated by the contrast that if he does not adopt all promiscuously to the hope of salvation, but gives to some what he denies to others, it is plain how greatly ignorance of this principle detracts from the glory of God and impairs true humility. But truth thus necessary to be known, Paul declares that it cannot be known unless God, throwing works entirely out of view, elect those whom he has predestined. From this we infer that all who know not that they are the peculiar people of God must be wretched from perpetual trepidation, and that those, therefore, who by overlooking the three advantages which we have noted, would destroy the very foundation of our safety, consult ill for themselves, and all for the faithful. What? Do we not here find the very origin of the Church, which, as Bernard rightly teaches, could not be found or recognized among the creatures, because it lies hid in both cases wondrously within the lap of blessed predestination and the mass of wretched condemnation?
Fundamentally, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant type of Christianity that's practiced by the American Calvinist, the American Republican, is a far cry from Orthodox Christianity or anything that Jesus, the real Jesus, would have recognized as authentic Christianity, right? Because fundamentally, the worldview of the right-wing Christian conservative who sees Thomas Sowell as a hero, who basically believes that, people who are wealthy deserve their wealth, and people who are poor deserve to be poor, right? Is fundamentally a Calvinist worldview, because the Calvinist who believes in predestination believes that people who are going to hell deserve to go to hell because it has been predestined already, right? And there's nothing you can do about it. In fact, to say that this is unfair would be an insult to the Creator, right? Because if you believe that the world is fundamentally unfair, then that would be an insult to the Creator, according to the Calvinist theology. Because it is God who created the world. So to say that the world is unfair, needs fixing, is therefore an insult to God, saying that God is unfair, right? So fundamentally, the idea behind Calvinism is basically that certain people have been chosen to be among the elect from the day they are born, and certain people have been condemned to hell from the day they are born as well, through no fault of their own, of course. So you can easily see how the modern right-wing ideology is influenced by Calvinism, by its fatalism in stating that, the world is already a fair place and you shouldn't try to change it. And people who are rich or successful deserve their privileges. And people who are poor and unsuccessful, well, it sucks to be them because they are simply not among the elect, right? And this idea of predestination is not something that is of any particular race or anything, right? I mean, you could be ethnically Asian, but if you have a modern right-wing worldview, you are still culturally Calvinist, right? Like, for example, take this quote by Lee Kuan Yew, for example, right? This quote basically states that in any society, no matter what you do, some groups will always do better than others, right? And there's nothing that can be done about it. You just have to accept it. So fundamentally, this in itself is a Calvinist worldview. The idea of genetic destiny, like if you're born to this group, it's basically your genetic destiny to do not as well as the other groups, right? But you don't even need to be a Christian to be a Calvinist, right? Social Darwinists, people who took Darwin's philosophy to an extreme, are also Calvinists in the sense that they believe that, certain races are among the elect. Certain races are more deserving to rule, and certain races should be ruled, because fundamentally that is also a Calvinist ideology. The idea of inequality is predicated upon Calvinism. And although Darwin himself was not religious, fundamentally he was culturally Calvinistic, in that he believed that certain races were natural winners or destined to win in this survival of the fittest game, and certain races were destined to be wiped out because, simply put, they were not among the elect in the game of natural selection, right? So you see how Calvinism has basically seeped out even into the areas which are supposed to be secular, like like in biology, or in even things like politics, or when making public policy. Calvinism is such a pervasive sort of influence on the modern world, right? Because the modern right-wing ideology is fundamentally based on Calvinism. That, you don't even need to be a white person, you don't even need to be a Christian to be culturally a Calvinist who believes that the world is fundamentally fair, and some people are predestined for greatness while others are predestined for failure, right? And certain groups, therefore, are also predestined for greatness, while certain other groups are destined to serve those more successful groups, right? You can also blame that on Calvinism, right? Because, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, right, the Singaporean schooling system is such that basically the strongest students get the best resources, right? Because the best resources and the best teachers are given to the students who are assumed to be the most promising candidates, right? And that itself is a form of ideological Calvinism as well. The idea that, you can see who's going to be successful in life and who's going to be a failure by looking at their examination results. And fundamentally, that's because that is fundamentally the Calvinist worldview. The Calvinist worldview states that, certain people are predestined for success, or certain people are predestined for failure. Just like certain people are predestined for salvation, and certain people are predestined for damnation. And you can blame it all on John Calvin and his toxic mantra, basically. So you can also point to prosperity gospel gurus like Joel Osteen, these mega church pastors who fly in private jets. You can also blame this prosperity gospel nonsense on Calvinism, because these people fundamentally consider themselves to be among the elect, right? And if you are blessed by God in life, it is a sign to these people that you are among the elect. And if you are down on your luck, you're some poor chap in the ghetto, well, it is a sign to them also that you're not among the elect, you see. That is why American right-wing Christians do seem to have a sense of distaste for poor people, because, well, they view them as being cursed by God fundamentally. Now, it might be a subconscious thing, they might not be thinking it consciously, but that is how they see the world, right? So yeah, that's about it for today. Thank you for listening if you made it this far. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel, guys. I hate seeing freeloaders on this page like those rapacious billionaire capitalists, people who watch my content and don't have the heart to just click the bloody subscribe button. Please don't forget to click subscribe. And yeah, right-wing ideology is fundamentally a nihilistic, fatalistic ideology that will lead us to hell on earth if we don't stop it, right? And how do we stop the right? Well, we do that by promoting left-wing ideology, social justice, hope for the future, and equality and human dignity for all. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.